Born in this house in Hartford, Connecticut in 1837, John Pierpont Morgan had a far more privileged upbringing than the other tycoons we've heard about. But that didn't make this young boy any less driven to succeed. His father, Junius, a wealthy banker, began pushing Pierpont at an early age to take an interest in business. So while other boys played sports, Pierpont spent his time studying account books.
At 7 or 8, he would go to his father's office with him and sort of learn about account books and interest rates, and it's rather comical. It's sort of a central casting life.
In 1854, Pierpont's parents sent him to boarding school in Switzerland, where he quickly distinguished himself.
He was quite a natural leader. Very early on, he was the one in charge of whatever was going on. He took command of sporting expeditions. He organized card games and hikes. So he was definitely the person who took charge.
In 1857, Morgan got his first job as a clerk in a New York bank. He was only 20 at the time, but that didn't stop this ambitious young man from trying to run things. When his bosses sent him to New Orleans to buy cotton, Morgan came across a shipload of coffee at a bargain price. He bought it on the spot. His bosses were furious. That is, until they found out about the huge profit Morgan made on the resale.
Morgan was very sure that the way he wanted to do things was the right way to do them. He didn't stop and wonder, gee, should I do this or should I do that? He just saw what he thought needed to be done, and he did it.
In 1861, Morgan left the bank to go into business for himself. Working with his father, now a leading American banker in London, Morgan specialized in finding Europeans to invest in American businesses.
It's important to remember that Europe was the source of capital. The United States was a developing country that didn't have extra capital.
Pierpont, working in New York, and his father Junius, working in London, found very good properties to represent, and once they took responsibility for them, they followed through.
If a company Morgan backed went bankrupt, he would hire new managers and monitor it until it was back in the black. In this way, he gained a reputation as someone who always made a profit for his investors.
His word was good. He did what he said he was going to do. So over time, both the other leading bankers of the world and the investors in Europe, on whom the U.S. was dependent at that time, they all learned to trust him, and that gave him tremendous power.
It wasn't long before Morgan had established himself as one of the top financiers of his day. He had a hand in financing just about every major deal, including Thomas Edison's first electric light company.
Morgan was the first of the real important finance capitalists. If Astor was a merchant capitalist and Carnegie was an industrial capitalist, Morgan was a financial capitalist. And he realized, before anybody else, that whoever controlled money controlled everything else.
In 1879, Morgan extended his control even further by focusing on America's biggest growth industry, railroads. He quickly came to dominate the railroads by demanding that in exchange for investment capital, they give him a seat on their boards of directors.
Once he got onto the boards of the railroads, he quickly made clear to the other members of the boards that he was smarter, that he had greater insight, that he knew what the railroads ought to do.
Morgan's position as both banker and board member gave him incredible influence, so that by the 1890s, he was one of the most powerful men in the country.
J.P. Morgan arguably had more power than any other private citizen in American history. He controlled 1/3 of America's railways. This at a time when railways comprised 60% of all the stocks in the New York Stock Exchange. He controlled the 3 largest insurance companies, much of the shipping on the North Atlantic.
Morgan had the power, directly or indirectly, to hire and fire hundreds of thousands of workers, and businesses across the country relied on his railroads to deliver their goods. The general public came to fear Morgan. Few men have ever had such a stranglehold on the American economy, and even his appearance was intimidating.
He was a man who had a booming voice. He had this icy, pitiless gaze. And of course, most unforgettably, he had this great red disfigured nose.
As he got older, a hereditary skin disease turned Morgan's nose into a monstrosity.
It made him quite frightening to me. You couldn't greet him without looking at his nose, and he had a kind of defiant glare that challenged you to look him square in the face and not flinch at the sight.
Morgan was powerful enough to insist that only photos in which his nose had been retouched were ever printed. But a few slipped past his control. Morgan's overwhelming power made him so unpopular with the general public that politicians wanted nothing to do with him. But in 1895, when the U.S. government's gold supply dropped dangerously low, President Grover Cleveland had no choice but to ask Morgan for help. Only Morgan could raise funds fast enough to prevent the U.S. economy from collapsing.
Morgan was the only one who commanded the resources, who commanded the confidence of moneyed people around the world to pull it off. He knew it, President Cleveland knew it, everybody knew it.
It took Morgan just a couple of days to round up enough European investors to buy roughly $60 million in government bonds. Morgan had averted a national crisis. But as people pointed out, his motive was not entirely altruistic.
J.P. Morgan wasn't acting from a benign interest in helping the country. J.P. Morgan was out for himself, and he took a very hefty commission for when he sold the U.S. government's bonds to the Europeans. He didn't do it for free.
Morgan would spend the last years of the 19th century consolidating smaller companies into larger, more successful corporations. He oversaw the creation of such corporate giants as General Electric, International Harvester, and AT&T. And then, in 1901, the jewel in the crown, he combined Andrew Carnegie's steel operations with other mills to create U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. Morgan had reached the peak of his power by 1907, when the country got caught in another economic crisis. And once again, a U.S. president, this time Theodore Roosevelt, would call on Morgan for help. The crisis began when a major New York commercial bank collapsed, causing a run on other banks. To stop the panic, Morgan decided to set up a rescue fund to prevent the crisis from spreading nationwide.
Morgan assembled all of the city's bankers in his very ornate library, and he locked the doors, pocketed the key, and told the bankers that they could not leave until they had come up with $25 million for this rescue fund. And finally, around 5 o'clock in the morning, the bankers agreed to contribute to this fund, and Morgan was nice enough to let them go home and get some sleep.
Once again, Morgan had used his personal influence to save the U.S. economy. Even President Teddy Roosevelt, a well-known enemy of monopolies, commended Morgan for his role.
And for about a minute, he was a national hero. As he walked down Wall Street, people cheered. But a minute after that, the exercise of that much power by one private citizen really horrified a nation of Democrats. And eventually it led to the setting up of the Federal Reserve.
In 1913, J.P. Morgan died in his sleep. He was 75 years old. At the time, everyone had just assumed Morgan was spectacularly wealthy. So the news that his estate was valued at just $80 million, far less than Carnegie's hundreds of millions, came as a shock. As John D. Rockefeller was said to have remarked, "And to think, he wasn't even a rich man." Morgan left all his money to his family and divided his extensive art collection among museums in New York and Hartford. But while J.P. Morgan may not be remembered as America's wealthiest tycoon, his power was indisputable.
Nobody could have that much power today, to be the raiser of capital and the unofficial central banker of the country. It's just unimaginable. There are federal agencies that do some of those jobs, but one private banker doing that for 20 years is quite astonishing.